There we go. All right, Bruce, I guess it's all yours.
Thank you, Nick, and welcome to everybody for this conversation this evening on challenges facing organized religion. And a really excellent panel has been assembled, and I'm just going to introduce our speakers when it's their turn. Each one is going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then I'll introduce the next speaker, and again, another 15 minutes, and we'll then be open to questions to each other and from the larger group.
If you click on the link in our newsletter, it's asking for a passcode.
Okay. Sorry, my wife just came in to say that she's having difficulty getting on. I'll deal with that in just a minute.
Right.
So let me introduce the first speaker here. Is Janine Alexander. She's the pastor of the First United Methodist Church in Duluth, also known as Coppertop. She's been there since 2017. And before that, she served churches in the Twin Cities for 24 years, like Harriet United Methodist Church, Crosswinds United Methodist Church, and Minnetonka United Methodist Church. She deeply appreciates the combination that the role her position provides for a warm heart, a strong intellect and theology, and an emphasis on active mission and social justice. Her ministry experience has served to confirm her call, strengthen her enthusiasm and passion for ministry, and provide opportunity for personal growth. During times of joy, success, and celebration in ministry, she can't believe she's been paid to be able to do this wonderful work. In times of crisis, disappointment, and difficulty, it is her deep and clear call that keeps her focused, centered, and moving forward. Welcome, Janine.
Thank you, Bruce. Should I just begin, Nick?
Yep.
Well, good. Good to be here, everyone, with all of you. As I thought about this topic, challenges to organized religion, I recognize that it isn't a new topic, although the pace of people's waning interest in religion does seem to be increasing at a faster pace than ever. I think the pandemic has intensified this, but didn't at all create the situation. I grew up in a Baptist church here in Duluth, West Duluth. I loved it growing up, the caring attention from adults, the friendship, the supportive environment. I felt drawn to God. But when I hit high school age, I began having a lot of questions, and questions were met with pat answers that just didn't resonate with me. And questioning the answers given was not encouraged. And I noticed that my particular church and denomination thought that their way of understanding God was the right way, and others who saw it differently were clearly wrong. And that didn't resonate with me. And I observed that women didn't have equal status, and that gay folks were shunned and even seen as dangerous. And this didn't fit at all with my intuitive understanding of a God of unconditional love who created us all in God's own image. So I decided that church wasn't something that I needed or wanted. However, when I was in college, I needed a job, and a youth director position opened at a United Methodist church. All my warm and positive youth group experience and feelings came back to me, and I took that position and found in the United Methodist Church a place where I could ask questions, and that the questions were valued and the answers weren't forced on me. And I found a place where people were treated in a more inclusive way, as I understood God's intention for people. Certainly, the church has been changing for generations. Unfortunately, for the most part, it has been declining. The United Methodist Church, of which I am a part, has been declining for more than 50 years and is currently in a time of division. As we think about current and future church, I think it helps to consider societal shifts from the past few decades, as well as looking forward to changes that will occur in the future church that has been impacted so by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as widespread consciousness of racism and spiritual and sexual fundamental societal shifts that have been occurring over the past 50 years. to look at ways that the church has changed and what those changes require of leadership, I look to concepts from Gil Rendell's framing in Quietly Courageous, Leading the Church in a Changing World from 2019 to guide my discussion, along with thoughts from other leaders in theological education. Rendell outlines three major shifts from United States culture that the church has undergone over approximately the past 50 years. The aberrant versus post-aberrant time, the shift from convergence to divergence, and the task of facing adaptive challenges as opposed to technical ones. Aberrant to post-aberrant time. Rendell names the time of the church growth that happened during the 1940s and 1950s, the aberrant time. He states, the memory that still captures the baby boomer church leaders is growth and having to run to catch up with a wave of people ready to join and be active participants in the life of congregations. Clearly, that is no longer the case in the 21st century church. And yet, according to Pew Research in 2021, our churches are composed of and led by many baby boomers and members of the silent and the greatest generations, with many fewer members of the following generations. Rendell states that for several decades now, the assumption seemed to be that the natural way of things was for people to attend worship, and if they just had a bit more information, could be just a bit more committed, then they would surely turn up. In the aberrant time, mainline churches thrived. The term aberrant is important here as it acknowledges that what seems normal to folks who grew up with church as a part of mainstream culture in their daily lives is actually not how it has always been. In the aberrant time, church was a way of life, and respectable members of the community were involved in congregations. Churches provided social and support networks, taught civic values, and membership could sometimes serve as a sign of status. Churches adapted to this cultural reality with campaigns to raise funds for higher budgets. They provided more programming and built larger facilities to accommodate the social center that the church had become. Rendell notes that there are times and seasons when a convergence of unique conditions creates an environment that births and sustains flourishing growth that is uniquely tied to that moment, but that cannot continue beyond the moment that created it. Because this growth cannot and is not sustained, the leadership task in the post-aberrant time is managing the aftermath. Churches are saddled with buildings and governing structures that reflect a time when congregations were bursting to the seams. Now congregations must deal with the shock that comes with a major shift in how individuals view the church and the church's role in society. Rendell also outlined some of the reasons for this shift into the post-aberrant time. One of these is a transition from a convergence culture to one of divergence. In a convergence culture, you lead with your sameness. In a divergent culture, you lead with your difference. In a convergent culture, uniform answers are easier to come by as individuals set aside their desires for the will of the group. If instead difference is valued, there is not one specific answer that can be trusted to represent the truth. Mainstream United States culture has shifted from valuing institutions which promote common values to a focus on individuals and their unique attributes and desires. Thus, leadership becomes more complex when many different truths need to be considered instead of people agreeing to the authority's truth. A third major shift that Rendell highlights is that of the very nature of the challenges that are present for religious communities today. In the past, we often thought of problem solving as linear, solving technical challenges that had clear-cut solutions. The fact that people trusted institutions also made it possible for them to trust the solutions that the church authority proposed. Problem solving in the church and other institutions is now different in that we face the adaptive challenges of a non-linear time where there are not clear-cut solutions and where people don't simply trust institutional leaders. It's natural for religious organizations to prefer to treat adaptive problems as technical ones. That way, we hope we can solve the problem without changing, taking a loss, or giving up anything. The space where the church exists today is truly an adaptive situation that requires not the loud assurance that comes with leaders with known solutions, but the quiet, courageous resolve of leaders willing to enter the wilderness and look at deeper questions of purpose and context. Back to where we are in current society with the decline in religious attendance. It can be discouraging to put your heart into your ministry and still see it plateau or worse, decline. But that's the reality facing many churches today. According to one study I read recently, 94% of churches aren't growing, they're declining. That means more than 9 out of 10 are stuck or losing ground. And yet people in our community are experiencing widespread loneliness, polarization, and hopelessness, and now a pandemic. And they need the local religious organizations more than ever before. As we are finishing 2 years of a pandemic, many churches are facing a similar reality. A lot of people aren't coming back to worship, at least in-person worship. Even formerly rapidly growing churches are facing the same challenge. A few churches that have surged past their pre-COVID attendance numbers are there, if you count online attendance, but most are not making these rebounds. We thought at first it was a lack of a vaccine that caused the in-person decline. And then we thought it was the variants. But even relief from the variants hasn't led to a surge that erases the in-person loss. We wondered if people were generally simply fearful. While many people who haven't come back to church regularly go shopping, to indoor sports events and concerts, dinner out, and vacations. Is it possible that the emotion isn't fear as much as it is indifference? And truth be told, churches overall were experiencing decline in in-person worshipers for decades. I think indifference may well be the prime reason. Indifference is defined as a lack of interest, concern, sympathy, or importance. I don't think people hate in-person church. I don't think there is a surge of stronger than ever negative emotions. It's just no longer very important to many people. People have assessed what matters, and growing numbers of people have decided that attending church just isn't that important. The truth is that the way churches and religion for decades have dealt with politics, racial justice, inclusion of many kinds certainly hasn't helped matters and has made people very mad and led to people leaving church, or at least leaving a particular church. Still, I don't see these topics as explaining the massive decline we have and are seeing in organized religion. In an article by Carrie Newwolf called "Fear Isn't Keeping People Home, It's Indifference, Why Church Attendance Has Plummeted," Newwolf talks about how there's something deeper going on here. Sure, some people have an axe to grind with church, and sometimes with good reason, but that's likely still a small minority of the people who disappeared from organized religion. Could it be that when it comes to people who stopped attending church, they don't hate church at all? They might even like the concept of church. They just don't think about it much. Could it be that many people didn't really leave church at all? They just stopped coming. They became indifferent. I have seen many commentaries and social media posts that assert that if you talk to a lot of people who no longer attend in person and are currently occasional online participants, they'll tell you they're still a part of the church. They'll name their church. They just stopped coming. That's what indifference does. You stop coming, but you never really think of yourself as left, so you don't have to deal with those emotions. You just drift away. You become indifferent to things when you no longer see value in them. It's just not significant enough for you to carve out time for it anymore. Increasing numbers of people are not seeing value in in-person attendance, so they dropped it. Some before COVID, some during COVID, some now, some without even realizing they actually dropped it. It's easy to say that people should see their faith as something that adds great value, and worship is something that they should do because the Bible commands it, and that is true. Except we're not talking about faith or even worship as much as we are talking about, in our case, Sunday attendance. And we're not talking nearly as much about the priority of gathering with other people in faith formation and service as we are about the actual gatherings most churches offer at a specific location, specific time, and specific format. Is it possible that people may not have rejected the idea of church as much as they've left the current expression of church? Carrie Nieuwhof talks about the antidote to indifference, saying that the antidote to indifference is passion. You are never indifferent to things you are passionate about. So we as religious leaders need to think about how to evoke our own passion for God's mission and that of the congregation. Where are our preferences, our method of how we live out religion getting in the way of the actual mission and purpose of our faith? Maybe it's less about getting excited about how we do our mission and our message, and more about getting excited about what the message and mission is itself and being willing to do it in new ways. Could it be that people who are indifferent about driving to a building perhaps aren't indifferent to the mission? Can we embrace the fact that the mission of the church gets accomplished as well and actually better outside the church walls than it does inside of them? Can we be positive, even excited about heading into hybrid, digital, decentralized future, thinking beyond the building? Is it possible that gathering people on Sunday mornings or your primary time of worship will be as important as ever? It just won't all happen in a building owned by the church or in a single room. With in-person and online worship, we at First United Methodist Church, the Copper Top, are exceeding our pre-COVID numbers. I think that's due to the fact that we were immediately able to offer quality online worship when COVID began. And now that we are in person, we are working even harder to improve the online experience, including the online folks as participants and not observers, and have chosen, as hard as it is, to not see online worshipers as second-class worshipers. And we're working ever hard to find opportunities for people to participate in areas of passion on their own schedules, in their own places. It's wonderful to gather people together. We need to do that. But if the church is going to re-engage society, buildings will have to stop being the epicenter of ministry, or the only center of ministry in some cases. People need religion. The world needs our churches and synagogues and mosques. But how we do it needs to creatively adapt if we are going to have greater impact and grow our witness.
Thank you, Janine. There's a lot there to ponder and to reflect on and to engage in conversation about. But we'll save that for a bit later and kind of move directly into Bishop Amy Ogren's presentation. And I will introduce her now. The Reverend Amy Ogren was elected Bishop of the Northeastern Minnesota Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in August of 2020. Prior to her election, she had served as the Synod's Director for Evangelical Mission and as assistant to the bishop. Amy grew up in Fairfield, Iowa, and attended Gustavus Adolphus College in St. Peter, Minnesota. In 1983, she married Steve, a New Englander, and was transplanted to Massachusetts. For 17 years, she worked in the field of supports and services for adults with cognitive and physical disabilities. At the urging of her family, she finally answered God's persistent call to ordained ministry, graduating from Wartburg Theological Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. She has served congregations in Holmen and Eau Claire, Wisconsin. In addition, she served on the Synod staff in the Northwest Synod of Wisconsin. Amy and Steve have 3 adult married children and 1 grandson. They enjoy living on Leech Lake, a place that has significant family history. And I believe that's where you're zooming in from tonight. So welcome, Bishop Amy.
Thank you. It's good to be with you all this evening. And what a wonderful topic that we are all engaging in this evening. Levels of trust in this country, in our institution, in our politics, and in one another are in precipitous decline. And when social trust collapses, nations and institutions begin to fall. In an Atlantic magazine article dated October 5th of 2020, author David Brooks noted that American history is driven by periodic moments of moral convulsion. He cites the late Harvard political scientist Samuel P. Huntington, who noticed that these convulsions seemed to hit the United States every 60 years or so, the revolutionary period of the 1760s and 70s, the Jacksonian uprising of the 1820s and the 30s, the progressive era, which began in 1890s, and the social protest movements of the 1960s and early 70s. These moments share certain features. People feel disgusted by the state of society. Trust in institution plummets. Moral indignation is widespread. Contempt for established power is intense. In these moments of agitation and excitement, frenzy and accusation, mobilization and passion. In 1981, Huntington predicted that the next moral convulsion would hit America around the second or the third decade of the 21st century. That's about right now. And of course, he was correct. Our moment of moral convulsion began somewhere around the mid-2010s. Systems lost legitimacy and the earthquake had begun. The events of 2020, the coronavirus pandemic, the killing of George Floyd, militias, social media mobs, and urban unrest were like hurricanes that hit in the middle of that earthquake. They did not cause the moral convulsion, but they accelerated every trend. They flooded the ravines that had opened up in American society and exposed every flaw. So here we are, in a convulsion that brought us to this fateful moment. And I believe the central focus of where we find ourselves now is rooted in social trust. Social scientists define social trust as a measure of the moral quality of a society, of whether the people and the institutions in it are trustworthy, whether they keep their promises and work for the common good. When people in a society lose faith or trust in their institutions, the church notwithstanding, and when they lose faith or trust in each other, there is collapse, decline, perhaps even a loss of faith or trust in God. And this has left us in a broken, alienated society caught in a distrust doom loop. The baby boomers grew up in the 1950s and 60s in an era with family stability, widespread prosperity, and cultural cohesion. Most families were active in faith community. The mindset boomers embraced in the late 60s, have embodied ever since, was all about rebelling against authority, unshackling from institutions, and celebrating freedom, individualism, and liberation. The emerging generations today enjoy none of that sense of security. They grew up in a world in which institutions failed, financial systems collapsed, and families were fragile. Children can now expect to have a lower quality of life than their parents. The pandemic rages, climate change looms, and social media is vicious. Their worldview is predicated on threat, not safety. Thus, the values of millennial and Gen Z generations that will dominate in the years ahead are opposite of boomer values, not liberation, but security, not freedom, but equality, not individualism, but the safety of the collective, not sink or swim mediocrity, but promotion on the basis of social justice. Once a generation forms its general viewpoint during its young adulthood, it generally tends to carry that mentality with it to the grave 60 years later. So a new culture is dawning. Will faith communities be able to embrace such change? Well, one question that David Brooks asked in his Atlantic article really stuck with me. Are we living through a pivot or a decline? He pointed out that during past moral convulsions, Americans rose to the challenge. They built new cultures and institutions, initiated new reforms, and a renewed nation went on to its next stage of greatness. But he points out that the events of these past 6 years, and especially of 2020, have made clear that we live in a broken nation. He says the cancer of distrust has spread to every vital organ. Renewal is hard to imagine when trust is the major concern. I've also done some reading by theologian Professor Andrew Root as he studies churches in the secular age, and he offers analysis of the impact of postmodernism on faith formation, clergy, faith leaders, and congregations. His work is informed by the theology of Karl Barth and the sociology of Harmut Rosa. Andrew Root tries to contextualize their thought to this century, and his work is engaging as he relates his learnings to a fictitious congregation, St. John the Baptist Church. Two important components that shape Root's thought are immanence, that is, which is here, material and established by the methods of modernity, and resonance, that which is transcendent, not framed by the natural order of culture, but is of God. Root contends that we are living in a time when it's harder to point to and therefore build communities around robust articulation of God's activity in the world. The institutional church and local congregations are in crisis. He points out that we keep interpreting this crisis as a loss of people and resources. But it's really the radical transformation of belief itself. Perhaps this is what it means to have a crisis of mission. As a response to declining church attendance and the decline of religiosity in the secular age, Root suggests that the church has sought out ingenuity and relevance, and in doing so, has made the church itself the subject of its own story. The church has made its own survival as the primary mission. Because of declining attendance, declining giving, staff turnover, etc., and in effort to combat these trends, the church has sought out opportunities for growth that look starkly inward at what the church is and can offer, rather than point to the true subject of the church's story, to God. The secular age has underscored the negation of transcendence, and instead, all reality is understood and elevated through the self. It is willful decision to believe certain things. And in essence, faith is stripped of all transcendence. The institutional church, informed by the immanence of the secular age, has defined who God is, defined how one encounters God, and how we will be the church together. Modern existence has put the church in the position of waiting toward having things, having people, finances, programs. Well, Root suggests that when the world is waiting to have something, it fills our existence with things. He describes a second way of waiting toward being, not having. Waiting toward being gives us the freedom not to have the world, but to be freely in the world by waiting with and for the world. And in this way of waiting toward being, we become open to the possibility of encountering the God who is God. This is resonance, being open to transcendence. It's not simply about an emotion the church embodies. It is a call for affection, suffering, and conversation, but not a call for busyness and the immediacy or a call to wait toward having. Organized religion is the church waiting toward having, which is really just an assimilation of the immanent frame. We in our congregations have made our mission the mission of survival, an attempt to capture God on our own accord, rather than a community of existence who waits together to hear the voice of God in the world that is open neither to waiting nor listening for the voice of a transcendent God. So what now? What are we to do? Well, I really want to veer from anything prescriptive. And I certainly recognize that all contexts are not the same. There are no quick fixes or models of ministry or faith formation that will bring religion or churches to life and save them from the crisis of decline. But here are some thoughts. We need to keep the core of what the overarching mission is, the mission of a communal fidelity to the God who is God. What does this mean, however, for those of us in the practice of ministry where we have been taught that there are ways of doing ministry that work, and we too find ourselves in the rat race of church survival? I think it means this, that in the context of the imminent frame, declining church attendance and a cultural rejection of transcendence, our methods of ministry will not save us. And we must stop thinking that they will. All the moves from the method to method and from this context to that one, to fancy coffee bars and added to congregational entrances, to cool music offered, to skinny jean wearing leaders, you name it. At its core, these are attempts at relevance, and we can be assured that these attempts are grounded in the church itself as the main character of the story. Looking at practical resources and assessing sociological data and seeking to meet those in the context where we are not bad things, they're good. But if that's all we're doing and all we're for, the crisis of decline will only end when we grow tired of chasing the approval of modernity. Our call is to wait, to create space to wait together, and to be open to hearing the voice of a transcendent God in a world dominated by immanence. To wait together for the voice of God is to wait for the source of life itself, to encounter you and your faith community. Seeking survival is a march to a slow death. Seeking the living God is a march toward life together. I believe that this call is actually a return to who we are as God created us, as a generous and loving God, a God who desires nothing more than for us to be in relationship with God and with one another. And this return is a return to scripture that informs us, to prayer which connects us, and to deep listening, not to prescribe the hows of one's relationship with transcendence, but to be encouraged and informed by the many ways that God comes to us and inspires us for action in the world. I think that the church and organized religion is being transformed by our transcendent God. And hey, I'm the Lutheran in this mix tonight and presenting, so I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that there's a reformation happening. And this is where I get excited. It's happening now. And I don't think that it's any just by chance indication that we are the ones who are living it. We're called to participate in God's action, God's activity in this world. So friends, let's work together to see what God has in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Odgren. Again, for all of that rich theological reflection and pointing to, as well as those sociological and other sources and studies that helped us to think about this, the challenges to organized religion. So thank you so much. Our third panelist tonight is Nick Rushdie Hassan. Nick is on the board of directors of the Islamic Center of the Twin Ports in Duluth. That's the only mosque north of the Twin Cities in Minnesota. He teaches management information systems and business analytics at the Leibowitz School of Business and Economics at the University of Minnesota Duluth in the Department of Management there. And he's lived with Nani, his wife, in Duluth for the past 19 years. They have 6 children, all of them grown. He is studying Islam and the Quran for himself and to share with his family and friends. Welcome, Nick. Or this is your hosting, so thank you for convening us and inviting us and sharing.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the panelists. Well, as usual, I always give the disclaimer that I'm not a scholar of Islam and not an imam by any stretch. So I'm just sharing some thoughts that I have about Islam that I know of. Now, after listening to Pastor Janine and Bishop Amy, it looks like I might have to throw all my notes out and ad lib here, because a lot of what Pastor Janine and Bishop Amy mentioned resonated with me, with the Muslims, and so I might have to kind of approach it from a slightly different way. So I now realize first that the challenges to organized religion is actually worse than I thought it was. and especially after the pandemic, and I truly believe that, you know, God always sends us tests and something to make us realize and to make us work towards getting closer to him. And of course, the pandemic is one of those things that he sends to us for that, to that goal. So as Bishop Amy mentioned, the pandemic, and Pastor Jenny also mentioned, the pandemic has uncovered for us a lot of things about our religion that we previously had not realized. So let me start by saying that, first of all, I think that the term organized religion is a little bit of a misnomer. It implies that, you know, some people organize something that wasn't organized before. And for some, it is these organized religions that have been the source of harm for humanity. And that's, you know, partly the reason why surveys are showing that people are losing interest in religion. And as Bishop Amy says, people are losing trust in their organized religions, in their institutions. So perhaps the problem, therefore, is not that organized religions that are facing problems. It is perhaps because these organized religions have not adapted, have not done what they should be doing. As a result, they are actually distancing the people from religion, from God himself. Because the mission of the church, as Bishop Amy mentioned, is God, not the church. So religion can take organized form. The way I'm going to tackle this is to say that, for example, the Vatican, for example, is an example of religious organization. Now, I'm going to say that religion might be organized, the way religion might be organized, have little to do with the religious teachings themselves. And so, for example, if Jesus, peace be upon him, were alive, as the Vatican was set up, for example, or as these organized religions were set up, I'm not sure he would approve of the way they're doing it. So in Islam, for example, there is no hierarchy of clergy or imams. So in a way, there's no formality in terms of what an organized religion would look like in Islam. It's just religion. And religion, the name religion the word is deen, which actually comes from the word dain, which is a debt. So religion, as far as the word means, is that we are indebted to God and we have to fulfill that debt. So from now on, when I talk about these challenges, I'm going to actually be talking about challenges to religion itself. So Islam, Muslims are not, or actually rather Christianity Christians are not unique in terms of having problems with, declining attendance. Muslims are also facing that kind of problem of people abandoning their religion, especially the younger generation. So the question is, why is that happening? I think part of the problem has to do with how we all view religion. I'm a professor at UMD, and I teach two difficult majors, information systems and business analytics. And students who graduate from these programs are actually very highly paid. So some students, when they enroll in these programs, they are dreaming of a highly paid job. And they view professors like us as offering a service. So some of them actually go through school expecting, everything from paying tuition, but not doing much about it. And so education is something that they are buying. We are selling them this degree. They are customers. And of course, customers are always right. And customers need to be served. And it comes to the point where now, today, for example, teachers are rated based on the service they provide, not the valuable knowledge they have or the wisdom that society needs. And I think religion has somehow devolved to becoming something like this. Which mosque or which church am I going to be most comfortable with? Which mosque and which church is going to provide the best service? If I'm going to be donating anything, I better get something back for my donation. And so, in other words, religion, and by extension, God himself, has become something like Amazon.com to us. It's because we made an order, we prayed, and so we're expecting, like Amazon.com, that our order will be delivered the next day. God becomes this supernatural being whose job is to serve us. If we're in trouble, we go to God. If we need something, we pray, and God is supposed to answer our prayers. Sometimes I tune into religious sermons, and I hear in some of these sermons the same message, and these are literally verbatim some of the words that I hear. We're working hard and we're not getting good breaks. The loan did not get through. We're coming down with an illness. It seems like the doors are shut. You're all locked out. But God is the doorkeeper. God is the one who's going to provide all of these things to us, solving our problems, just like Amazon.com. We want something, we make an order, and since we're the customers, we expect that service from God, whether it's a promotion, whether it's healing, whether it's freedom, all this stuff that we need in this world. Even the same preacher that was talking about, all this promotion and healing that's offering, even the story of the Israelites that he mentioned in his sermon became the story of about getting stuff. And these were the exact words. He would say, the Israelites are wandering for 40 years, shut down from the promised land, as if it's the promised land that's the real story behind them wandering for 40 years. The story that, that they actually rebelled against their own prophet, that they worship a golden calf or refused to fight for justice, somehow got lost in the narration. And what is put forward, or what is highlighted, is the fact that, oh yeah, you're deserving of that promised land. Again, just like Bishop Amy mentioned, it's having something, getting something. That's what religion has devolved into. So, and the problem with this is that when some people start praying and they're looking at God as this being that's going to serve them, and they don't get what it is that they're praying for, they start getting doubts. I've been praying to God for months now. I've donated to the mosque or to the church, but my cancer is still not cured. What's going on? Why is God not answering my prayers? And this is perhaps one reason why many have left religion, because it is the understanding that they have of God. They have not internalized their relationship with their creator, with their God. So in the Quran, God puts us in the right place, corrects our understanding. So these people who are demanding all these things from God forget, for example, that they're created from and God mentions in the Quran, I'm going to read this Arabic here. He says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أولم يرى الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين. Does not man see that it is we who created them from an oozing fluid, the semen God is talking about here. And yet he argues and he rebels. In other words, we come from a humble origin. We come from dirt. We come from an oozing fluid. And we're able to argue and we rebel against, against God. We're too full of ourselves and forget who we are when we stand in front of our Creator. So we are supposed to be creations of God, slaves of God. Abd, the word is. Once we internalize that fact, it changes everything. Everything that, we understand that everything that we have, we owe to God. We don't deserve anything, and yet He gives us everything. So, and one of the greatest gifts that He's given is actually His guidance, His messages to us. Imagine the Creator of the universe, who created, God knows, 100 billion galaxies, not 100 billion planets, 100 billion galaxies that we know of today. Each galaxy containing 100 billion planets. That same God decided to speak to us through His prophets and His messengers. What greater gift is that? And that is the reason why in the Quran, it's mentioned, and the Quran goes, Ar-Rahman, the most gracious. Allama al-Quran. He is the one who taught the Quran. Khalaq al-Insan. He is the one that created mankind. God put the message before the creation of mankind. In other words, the fact that He's talking to us, whether it be through the Quran, or whether it be through the Torah, whether it be through the Injil, the book that was sent to Jesus, that is actually more amazing than even the creation of mankind. So that is what our position is, our status is. So when we understand and we internalize that, then we realize that, this whole idea that God is supposed to serve us is not right. We should be figuring how we are to serve God. That we are the one that is in need of God. And it really doesn't matter, if the whole humanity, the whole of mankind decided to reject God. It's not going to hurt God at all. It is we that needs God. So I'm just going to stop there and hopefully hear comments from our discussion that Bruce is going to introduce us next. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nick, for reminding us how deeply the culture of consumerism and affects even our religious practices so deeply. Very, as someone whose church is kicking off its annual fundraising campaign tomorrow, your words really speak to my condition. So I appreciate that. My understanding is that we have a respondent here tonight who is going to take a few minutes to reflect on what he's heard. So I'm just going to leave it up to Nate to introduce himself.
Thank you, Bruce, and I'm grateful to be a part of this conversation and to sort of kick off the response here. This is such a rich conversation. I'm so grateful for what you each have shared with us. There's a lot there. So I'm both in this moment kind of taking it in and seeing where I want to go. Maybe I should introduce myself a little more before I start my thoughts here. That's a good place to start. So my name is Nathan Holst. I am the Faith Formation Minister at Peace United Church of Christ here in Duluth. My mom is on this call. Hi, Mom. Beth Holst. And I grew up in Duluth here. I grew up at First Lutheran. And maybe just relevant for this conversation, I am a late millennial. And I am one of those late millennials who had a really good experience growing up in church, stayed with it, and also had a period in college where I rejected Christianity and sort of said, I'm atheist or at least agnostic, and then kind of slowly made my way back through Quakers and Unitarian Universalists, and also appreciate my Lutheran upbringing. Now solidly landed, I think, in the UCC. But I've also, maybe another piece that's, I think, important in this conversation, I've also been a part of kind of experimental, you might say experimental house churches I lived in Portland, Oregon for 5 years, and I was a part of a small group called Wilderness Way Community, in which we talked about, led by a former Lutheran pastor, roots in the wisdom of Christianity and roots in the wisdom of nature. And one of the reasons I wanted to name that is because I heard both in Bishop Amy and Pastor Janine talk about relevance, right? And like, it just brought alive for me, like, where is the Spirit moving, right? We are clearly going through huge cultural shifts. And for me, in addition to Bishop Amy, you talking, I love that you brought up modernity and post-modernity, because that, like, I feel like I'm unpacking that all the time and think like, okay, am I hitting up against worldviews here? Where, like, am I talking with someone more in a modern worldview and a postmodern worldview? And what do I even mean by that? But, I've got some books that have told me that. I don't know if I can articulate it in this moment. But one very important piece is like this piece of like modernity, the one right truth, postmodernity, multiple truths, right? That, even just that, is huge in terms of how it impacts generations and how, at least in people in my generation, I think, seek out spiritual connection. Not like, church, give me the answers and give me dogma. I have tons of friends who are like, I don't really do Christianity because it's just too much dogma, right? And I have my own version of like, I don't want to do dogma either, although I'm one of those people that's like, okay, yes, tradition, give us what you got, right? Like, there is importance in tradition, even as most of me kind of like, it's like, oh, I'm allergic to you, but okay, I know there's goodness in you. So I guess I'm sort of shifting from my, my little intro here into some of my thoughts. But I think my assumption is always that Spirit is moving, no matter if we have organized religion or not. I mean, we talked about that. And kind of for me is, it's always like, well, okay, if I guess in some ways this is a response to some of what Pastor Janine said of like, all right, so if there's indifference out there, what else is out there, right? Like, my assumption is that there's something happening in people's spiritual lives. I mean, this is not a, obviously you were pointing to mission, right? Church, I agree, right? Church has to focus on mission, but like, what's happening in people's lives? Nick, as you said, within this consumeristic culture, it's got to start at least in this framework of like, what's happening in your life, millennials, Generation Z, because that's the starting place, even if we can also then get to the collective. But there's something happening there already, even if there's not a theology or a church connection. So for me, it's always like, well, what is happening, right? And I wrote down some notes here of what are people in my generation doing? Not just my generation, but yoga, right? There's something about yoga, embodiment. Yes. It's accessible. This is my like love-hate with our wisdom traditions. So many times, so inaccessible, right? There's so much richness in the tradition, but I think this is a huge challenge for people in my generation, because they're like, I don't want to listen to, I don't want to go to seminary to engage this tradition. I love yoga because it's accessible. I'll even name, like there's this, I don't know if you know this or not, but there's this like movement of re-engaging interest in astrology. You all may, depending on your generation, you might have a certain image of that, but there's a real movement for meaning systems, right? And people are hungry, I think, in their loneliness. People are hungry for meaning systems, and I think largely have sort of said, I don't want to do church. I got bad associations. Now this is my own experience, right? So like as we heard from Bishop Amy and Pastor Janine, there are larger studies that might point to something different. So I'm bringing my own experience here, but like the accessibility is important. So for me, like I've been sort of pondering, how do we I love, what's church 3.0? What's emergent church? We call it lots of different things, and at least within Christian circles. But like, what's the next version of what we're doing? What are the new containers? What does it have to look like? And I think the piece I wanted to add was, I think it also has to be, at least for most people, pluralistic, right? It has to make space for multiple traditions. It can't necessarily say, here, this is the one right way. So I think, I don't know, I feel like I'm jumping around to lots of different pieces here. So I guess I want to sort of wrap up my thoughts of like, here's what I see. This is what I've known. This is also sharing my own personal stories. So much of what I've said is there, all those pieces are a part of me. Love, hate the church, love, hate organized religion. I was also, here's another little thread. I was reading, I love Bishop Stephen Charleston, who's an indigenous Christian elder, who talks about his relationship to indigenous spirituality too, of like, he talks about dances, right? Dances are not a place where you need dogma. You don't have to have a common set of beliefs or even values. You can come and experience hope and dance together, right? That's why, at least from his view, that's why so many indigenous ceremonies are focused on dance, is because it holds space for the multiple realities, the multiple truths. So I think these are all sort of pieces that I wrestle with, both about myself, but also about people in my generation and below, right? Or that are younger than me, because I see climate change. I see, what happened with George Floyd in the aftermath, and every generation has its own challenges. But I say, wow, we need an amazing sense of faith, or at least spiritual grounding, to be able to give our best collectively to what's in front of us. So there's a little bit about my own bias toward spirituality and religion too, is it has to have a practical sense of like, what's going to ground me and give me life, right? If going to a church is not going to do that, okay, scrap that. Let's do something different that allows us to connect, not just do the individual thing of the meditation or yoga. Those have their place and they're good, but not just like what's going to give me the consumeristic sense of feeling good, right? We need something more than just that. So that's a lot of thoughts, I know, and I hope you could see where they came from and where they tied. I guess I'm curious, maybe particularly to Bishop Amy and Pastor Janine, but Nick, I'm curious your thoughts as well of when you think about millennials and Generation Z, in addition to your research, like either what are you hearing, or what do you notice about the starting place of how we engage in religion or in spiritual connection and community?
I'll go, and I'm really curious to hear what both Pastor Janine and Nick have to say too. But I think in what you were weaving was definitely this balance of we're in the secular age. We're in the secular age, and it's an age where there is this negation of transcendence, and I think that's sort of the tradition that's followed us, because there's a certain way that we worship. This is, we have to follow this order, come and be like us, kind of a invitation, rather than what you're expressing. It sounds like to me an openness for the transcendence, an openness for the sacred, an openness for a spiritual engagement that is the foundation for the relationship of letting God be God, rather than having an institution define for you who God is. And this is the way that we're going to engage with God. It sounds to me that what the craving is for millennials and Gen Zers is this engagement with the sacred, and that is that transcendence. And I think that is what the call for the organized church is, to say, how do we create a place to hear from people of how that engagement has impacted their life, who they are, how they understand God to be. because I think it enriches all of us when we hear the collective of the community together. And the thing about the secular age is that it is so understood and evaluated through the self. You know, I'm going to say whether it's, and that's what, Nick, you were terrific at, you know, that's that commodifying God. What does God have for me? You know, the Amazon.com God, I love that. I'm going to use that. You know, what do I want God to do for me, rather than, I think the expression of some of the unchurched, non-church, de-churched people are, no, give me a meaningful relationship.
As I think about that, I think about it in the lens of social justice and how the younger generation thinks about social justice differently. Several years back, maybe 8 years back, when Minnesota was looking at offering marriage for all, and our church in Minnetonka was having the discussion, will we as a congregation offer marriage for all, including LGBTQIA people? And I was so proud of the congregation for having this important social justice conversation and for making the decision that yes, they wanted to do it. And I was sitting down with my confirmation class, which are ninth graders, and they were absolutely horrified and said they can never invite their friends to this church. And I'm thinking, how can they never invite their friends to this church? We are working vigilantly to make sure all people are included. And they said, we're not inviting our friends to some place that has to discuss whether or not they're fully included. So whereas I'm thinking, yay, we're doing social justice talking about it, this generation two below me are saying, you're still having to talk about this? I'm not putting my friend in that kind of oppressive environment. And so I realized you can't even say social justice because the generations see that differently.
Thank you, Nathan, for your thoughts. Those are great. and the reason for that is because I have children who are millennials, and they are struggling with exactly the same things. So I guess I have two things to respond to that. The first has to do with what God has given us already, because obviously if he's a loving God and he wants us to be successful, and he's given us all the tools, and the things that he's given us, that is, you know, that is born within us, is the fact that he has already given us the light in us. And that's where the craving for spirituality comes from. It is that inborn light that God has given all of us. Doesn't matter who, doesn't matter what family they're born into, that light is in there. And if they are true to that light, then the light grows stronger and stronger by the day, because they're trying to, you know, reach out and connect with God. Now, on top of that, this is where religion comes in. This is where the message comes in. So the message that God provides for that light is actually light itself. So when, you know, for example, the law of Moses, for example, sent through the Torah. So the law of Moses is the light that cleanses and purifies whoever that follows that law, and the teachings of the Torah. Same with the teachings of the Injil through Jesus, and so the Quran and so on. That light, and in the expression in the Quran, is like this. It says light on light, light onto light, meaning that the moment these two light comes together, it becomes this bright, glowing, wonderful thing in us that makes us a beautiful human being. So that's one thing. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of these things takes place actually among the younger generation. And the reason why it's taking place among the younger generation is because they have no vested interest. They're still young. They're not millionaires yet. They don't have, you know, to worry about things that if they rock the boat, they're going to lose those things. So that is why most of the people who carried the message of the Prophet Muhammad were actually less than 25 years old. They were all younger than 25 years old. There were very few old people that was with the Prophet. In fact, the people that actually fought against him were his older uncles and his own families that fought against him. So the younger generation actually is the carrier of the faith, and reason is because they are the ones that are still pure, still innocent, and they're still idealistic. They're still searching for the truth, and it's because the truth is what is reflected in the light that's already within them. And so keep searching is what I guess is what I would say. Don't give up, because God will never give up on you as long as you don't give up on him. So that's just my thoughts.
So Nathan, I don't know if you had another question, or if perhaps we would just want to open it up to among the panelists to exchange with each other. I know, Nick, you had mentioned perhaps ending a little early tonight in anticipation of the iftar. So it's 6 minutes after 7 now. Should we aim for another 15 minutes of discussion, or 10 minutes, or?
Sounds good. Yep. Mm-hmm. So I guess we could open, or if Nathan has a question, or open it to the rest of the audience that we have. Absolutely.
I mean, always questions, but I love the idea of opening it up.
If it's okay, I'll just offer a question that I think Janine, Pastor Janine, talked about Gil Rendell's work and the three cultural shifts, and one of them was the shift from a I think it was about how we make decisions based on a convergence upon a single shared solution, let's say, or answer, and a shift from that convergent culture to one that is more divergent. I think Nathan did a wonderful job of describing how that actually shows up in the world, that divergent culture. But it strikes me, and this is up for anyone is that divergent, that situation of divergence and difference and diversity is the defining condition for interfaith dialogue, it seems to me. And I'm curious and frankly hopeful about what that might look like as representatives of different traditions approach each other, not trying to arrive at one, consensus answer, but rather listening for, respecting, responding to divergence or difference. Does that question even make sense, or in the context of this conversation? That's for anybody.
Go ahead, Nathan. I'd love to hear from you. Respond to that.
Sure. Well, what I'll say is what it makes me think of, again, you might hear me talk about Stephen Charleston a lot because I really love him, but he talks about interfaith dialogue and the importance of it. I've also watched him, post things every day, and he'll talk sometimes about, he believes that, this is sort of the Reformation piece, like we are in a moment where we're going to experience a new sense of collective spiritual renewal and essentially a maturity, right? And I love the way he frames it of this is, think about, we are the early ones, so our kids and our grandkids will look back on the work that we do now. And I think some of that is this interfaith dialogue. And actually what he puts out is just gather for a meal and have people bring pictures of their kids, and for those folks who have kids, and tell stories, right? And I was like, what a really amazing way of connection, because that it doesn't necessarily do the divergence piece. Like, I think that's really important too, and I love those pieces. But for me, it's like this way of taking the divergent experiences and connecting around something that's really common. So I'm not sure if I'm actually answering your question, Bruce, but that's what came up in my mind.
Don't they in doing that and having families come and talk with children, you understand the divergence.
Exactly.
You learn, because you learn about
Yes.
parenting, you learn how they see things.
Yes. And maybe that's, maybe we're already doing that in many places too. Yeah.
I think sometimes too that coming together in some, and I know Pastor Janine, you did mention that maybe where we're at is not so much by fear, but as indifference. But I do think that fear does drive, some of, at least in our tradition, some of our congregations not being so open to divergence because it's going to somehow bring about change. It's going to somehow change the way that's comfortable, that is what we know. And so there is this fear. I don't think it's indifference. I think it's fear that I'm going to change somehow, and it's going to be somebody else changing me. It's not necessarily of God. It's not a spiritual sense of moving me to a place where that would move me to an more open place. And so, I love your idea of indifference, but I do think fear is still there too.
For people who aren't a part of church, or people who have left church, or for people who are in the church now?
I'm thinking of people in the church, and the divergence of thought, of idea, of even how we think of God rubs up against don't change my God.
And I would say that type of fear leads to indifference from those leaving or not coming.
Amen to that. I agree with you. I totally agree with you.
Looks like Beth has a comment or question.
This is so stimulating. Thank you so much, Nick, for organizing these dialogues. Oh, it's so wonderful. So many thoughts here coming from so many different directions. When you were talking, Bishop Amy, just a moment ago about that fear, it reminds me of a movie, Babette's Feast. If you haven't seen it, the symbolism is so wonderful, because Babette is this French chef who ends up living with a very simple living group of people who eat the same food every day. It's the tradition, and it's so plain. And here she comes with all this wonderful knowledge and of cooking. And finally, at the end of the movie, she makes them a feast, because I think of that as that divergence of, we just have our own little space. We've always done this. It sustains us, but it doesn't enrich us. It doesn't move us. And I think that for each of us, having the ability to know the stories within our own faith tradition, and I sometimes think that's what's missing. I think of many Lutherans, especially, we don't know, we haven't heard, we haven't really gone into depth the words of Jesus and understanding what these stories are saying to each of us as individuals. We're not steeped in the word, but then when we realize how wonderful and how amazing God is, it moves us because we're free to move, and we come together in interfaith ways and holding hands with each other to do the work that is such a privilege rather than a duty. I belong to a group called the Interfaith Committee for Migrant Justice, and I love that because it draws everyone to something like that. And even doing a meditation when we come together, you think about, what can I say from my faith tradition, and also in a way that it's inclusive of everyone who's here gathering. And it just makes my own faith deeper. And so these are just a few thoughts, but I just find that this is just so stimulating, and it's the way the church needs to move. And it is a pivot, I think. It's not a dying, as we have said.
In the earlier conversation, when we were talking about some of the cultural shifts that happen every 50 years, let's say, I was reminded, I believe Phyllis Tickle, who's a writer on religious topics, wrote a book a few years ago called The Great Emergence. And she thought that within the Christian tradition that something big shook up around every 500 years. And that included, the last time that happened was that the 16th century, or the 16th century Reformation. So what she calls the Great Emergence, and it's not restricted to Christianity, but she writes from a Christian perspective that what's happening now culturally and globally is what she calls a great emergence, because it's time. It's 500 years since that is kind of thing has happened, at least in the Christian world. I was just reminded of that when you were talking about cycles.
Bruce, if I could say a few ththings on what Beth mentioned just now, and also what you mentioned earlier. So thank you, Beth, for your words. It's wonderful to hear that. From what I understand of the relationship between God and us, because God has our back, because God wants us to succeed, wants us to return back to Him, right? So He will constantly communicate with us, constantly. And you were saying every 500 years, there's a verse in the Quran that says that people will be sent a sign every year, twice or so. Okay, so in other words, every year, every person will receive, every community will receive a major sign of reminder, or whether it is has to do with something that will shake them, bring them, humble them. It could be anything. A sign can be many things. But the point is that twice a year, it will happen. And it's up to us to respond to that. And more frequently than that, these signs are sent to us individually, whether it is has to do with a difficulty that we experience, or a death that that shaken us. So those signs are supposed to, I guess, beat the sense into us and say, what are you doing? Things like that. So and we can talk about science another time. It's going to take hours to discuss what sign is, obviously. but what I wanted to say is that relationship is done, and that's why, for example, in Muslims, for example, we're supposed to pray 5 times a day. So every day you are doing it voluntarily, right? 5 times a day, and of course every week you go to the mosque and so on. So that relationship is being enforced regularly, and the moment somebody, that's why prayer in Islam is called a pillar. So when you abandon prayer, which many Muslims do, they've abandoned the prayer. They don't pray 5 times a day anymore. So when they abandon the prayer, they essentially have lost a pillar. So like a pillar in a house, when you've lost a pillar, the whole house comes down. So these are the things that take care of those relationships between you and God. And you're supposed to take care of that in order to ensure that you're always close and you always be corrected. So I just wanted to say that, talking about things that happen every 500 years, or maybe just one more. This is one of the scholars mentioned this. I thought it was beautiful. So one of the things that God uses to remind us with it actually is the wind. So in many chapters in the Quran, the wind is mentioned. And the reason why the wind is so significant is because the wind is both a source of blessing and a source of punishment. So because when the wind comes in the form of a hurricane or tornado, obviously it's a reminder. And then this scholar was saying, look, you might not have received the Quran, you might not have gotten, you might not be accessible to these things, just like what Nathan mentioned. You want accessibility to this, right? You want to get it. Well, even if you somehow could not access those things that are directly sent to you, the wind should be enough for you, the scholar said. So the moment you see, a tract of land get destroyed, boom, hey, guess what? That should be enough for you to remind you of God. So I thought it was an interesting thing the scholar comment.
Yeah, it's a wonderful reminder, Nick, and maybe an appropriate place to conclude tonight, because we wanted to end a little bit early. It's 20 after. So, gosh, I mean, we could go on and that's the case every time I think we have this session. There's just so much to say, and I know we will go on with another topic next month. And just again, thank you to all who participated tonight, Bishop Amy, Pastor Janine, Nick, and Nathan, and all of you who have shown up tonight. So
thank you again. Thank you, Bruce, for
Thank you
being a
all.
wonderful moderator and taking us through this. And I would like to maybe last invitation to anyone who would like to come to the mosque. We are going to be holding our breaking of fast at 7:55 or 8 o'clock. Just make your way. Don't worry about registration or anything like that. There should be some people there already by now, actually. So again, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful session.
Thank you for your
Thank
hospitality.
you. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
Have a
Bye-bye.
good night.